On February the 4th this year, an earthquake struck Guatemala at precisely 3 minutes past 3 in the morning. It stopped the clocks and caused death and destruction on a truly staggering scale. The first tremor lasted for just 31 seconds, but it was enough to turn whole areas of Guatemala City, the capital, into crumbled ruins and to destroy most villages and townships within a 50-mile radius. Serious damage was spread across 16 of the nation's 23 departments. In the capital itself, 100,000 people were made homeless. Across the nation as a whole, the figure was over 1 million. That's a sixth of the total population. In the first terrible days, it was difficult enough to find the dead, let alone identify them. Over 23,000 people are now known to have died, 1,200 of them in the capital. These are the deaths officially reported. Nobody can guess how many more there may have been. The total of injured is put at 76,000, although there's likely to be a far bigger gap here between officially notified cases and the real figure. They were cared for by local doctors and medical teams flown in from abroad, notably the United States and Latin America. Guatemala is the most northerly of the Central American states. The earthquake did in fact hit other parts of the area, notably Honduras and El Salvador. But it was Guatemala which suffered most. The quake's epicenter was just 30 miles southwest of the capital. Nearly 3 months after the disaster, Guatemala City presents an image of surprising normality, but it's an impression that's soon dispelled. Behind the traffic-laden streets are many bare plots where tall buildings once stood. This was the site of the Continental Hotel. This was not, by the way, the capital's first earthquake. It was almost destroyed by one in 1917. Another hotel that's unlikely to see any more guests for quite a while. The quake came during Guatemala's tourist season, and it's not just the shortage of hotel bedrooms that's likely to affect the tourist trade now. The manager of this hotel, for example, insisted that work in progress was renovation only and nothing to do with the quake. Last year, Guatemala earned nearly $86 million from tourism. With 20% of its dwellings destroyed overnight, Guatemala City is still struggling with the problem of accommodation. The central square in front of the cathedral is now filled with squatters living in tents made of canvas or anything they could lay their hands on. Some are so flimsy they could quite literally blow away in a strong breeze. It's not so much poverty as the people's abiding fear of being crushed by falling masonry. We were told unofficially that some of these squatters had been homeless even before the quake, and that they had moved in here in the hope of being included in rehousing schemes. Under normal circumstances, those who can't find a home in the capital move out to the shanty towns, built on ravines on the outskirts. Damage here was considerable, but deaths were relatively low due to the absence of solid walls or tile roofs. Most of these people are far too poor to carry any kind of insurance. They simply have to pick up what they can. Across the nation as a whole, Insurance claims are likely to be less than a tenth of the estimated $1,000 million worth of damage suffered. At the other end of the scale, it was the sheer solidity of the houses which kept death and damage to a minimum. This is La Cañada, an exclusive suburb which houses some of Guatemala's wealthy few. Any damage there was seems to have been confined within the thick concrete walls. The situation here was very different. This is Zone 5, one of the hardest hit in the capital. It was a modest income suburb whose adobe houses were not as solid as those of the rich, nor as light as those of the poor. This is another settlement for the homeless, which has now been named after the February the 4th quake. The government had already earmarked this land for low-cost housing, but they can hardly have had anything like this in mind. It's meant to be temporary, of course, but already it's gaining an air of permanence. The camp has no piped water, sewage or electricity, but the people are adapting to conditions. There's always a water tanker on site, and there's always a queue, even though some women have to walk up to 2 miles to get it. For those who don't make it to the official camps, there's always an unofficial alternative somewhere else. And here, too, there's a rapidly growing sense of permanence. Getting a roof overhead is the main problem, but not the only one. Guatemala has warm, sunny days, but at night the temperature drops sharply. Warm clothing is essential. Lots now arrive from charitable organizations overseas. There are many international charities helping Guatemala, including the Salvation Army, CARE, Oxfam, and of course the Red Cross. The aid's been coordinated by United Nations relief agencies, and the effort's been divided up geographically to avoid any wasteful overlapping. Priority's been given to providing surgical kits, medical supplies, and food. There's also been considerable financial aid from governments, though Guatemala at first refused an offer from Britain, with whom it's in dispute over the colony of Belize. The offer's since been accepted. The Puente Curva, the curved bridge over the Rio Grande that carries the Atlantic Highway to the northern coast. Or rather, it did, until the quake reduced its graceful curves to a tangle. Restoring communication has been left mainly to American military engineers operating out of Camp Gridley, 25 miles northeast of the capital. The Americans were on the spot and working within days of the disaster. They won wide praise for their speed and efficiency. This is the new bridge they've built to replace the Puente Curva. It's been named after a US private, Kenneth Woolley, who died whilst working on the project. One of the main problems has been landslides. This is the one they call El Grande, the big one, further down the highway. According to local people, there's a bus buried underneath. The former road level can still be seen in places. Repairing the highway has been made a priority task because it carries a major portion of Guatemala's exports to the docks at Puerto Berrío. Latest estimates are that it'll be ready by the beginning of May. It's not the usual town band, but it was all that could be mustered here to welcome a very important visitor, Guatemala's president, General Kiel Logurud Garcia. He's been touring affected areas to assess need. On the day following the earthquake, the president went on television to reassure the nation and call for an immediate response. But the administration has itself been accused of being slow off the mark in the first couple of days. Some charity workers have also been unhappy at what they feel to be the government's over-tight control of the relief operations. The worst hit state in Guatemala was Chimaltenango. More than 13,000 people were killed here, accounting for well over half the country's total death toll. 90% of the state's property was also destroyed, and today, 3 months after the quake struck, virtually every road in the state bears some scars of the disaster. Chimaltenango City, the state capital, was the hardest hit municipality, with casualties of nearly 4,000 among its 20,000 population and 3/4 of its buildings destroyed. Still to be cleared, the town's fallen bandstand. But gradually, the townspeople have applied themselves to the tasks of clearance and reconstruction. One of the first jobs is to demolish those buildings that are still standing, but which are too badly damaged to repair. They're dismantled to provide building material for new homes. In many cases, the human damage is still to be repaired too. 4 out of 5 hospitals in the country were wrecked, placing an almost intolerable pressure on the remaining medical services. This clinic is run by a former American missionary and US Navy doctor, Carol Bearhorst.
There were an awful lot of fractured
It was treating 30,000 patients a year, even before the earthquake. Bearhorst himself was out of the country when we visited, but his English staff nurse, Jenny Rothwell, showed us round.
This man had a compound fracture of his foot, but he had the most ugly open wound, and so he had to have his cast taken off, and we're treating his wound. And he'll probably have to go and be operated on later. Plus they're a little bit frightened because they're not used to being injured like this, and they don't understand that time will cure a lot of their broken bones. But they're brave people. show you another room.
The hospital is only a small part of a much wider self-help program that's earned Dr. Bearhorst considerable trust and affection among poor Guatemalans. This man's house collapsed on top of him, killing his family.
This was another fracture where his bone had come through to the outside of his leg. And for this reason, we can't put the cast completely on. It's so far taken 8 or 9 weeks since the earthquake, and we still haven't got it completely healed. ¿Hay de su familia murió?
¿Cómo no? Como murieron 6
6 of his family were killed. He survived.
We asked Nurse Rothwell about the progress of the relief program so far.
There's an awful lot of work remains to be done. People are now getting over the shock, and the tremors are beginning to stop. So people are feeling that they can go inside buildings a little bit more now. The people are afraid of further tremors. But even through the big tremor, they still acted cool, calm and collected. But they're afraid. They're afraid it's going to happen again. But they say God sent this. I asked somebody why the rains came early. And they said God is still punishing them. I don't know.
Another small town in Chimaltenango State, Tecpan. It was totally destroyed, and over 3,000 of its people died in these ruins. For many Guatemalans, life before the quake was tough enough. For many of the survivors, it's now even tougher. Yet there remains an amazing resilience among the people, an astonishing lack of frustration for the almost insurmountable tasks they face. The relief agencies, Salvation Army, CARE and Oxfam, are doing what they can to provide building materials for new homes. There's an acute scarcity of wood, which the government so far refused to solve by not allowing exploitation of Guatemala's forests. So the relief agencies have supplied corrugated metal roofing strips. Oxfam sell these cheaply, and CARE actually give them away. Another CARE project is the making of special lightweight reinforced concrete pillars for new houses. From small beginnings, engineers have developed the process to the point where they soon expect to be turning out 320 pillars a day, enough for 40 homes. Among those helping is Guatemalan engineer Aníbal Roxas, seen here in the aluminium helmet. The secret of the new system is the use of pumice, a volcanic rock in plentiful supply in Guatemala. When mixed with cement, this produces a concrete mixture 40% lighter than normal, but with virtually the same strength. Measured quantities of water are added to the mixture to prevent the pumice pieces from settling out. This particular mix took 2 hours to make and provided enough concrete to make the pillars for 8 houses. The mixture is left in the molds for 2 days to set, and then must be left another 20 days for curing before the pillars can be used. Their lightness and ease of construction means that small teams of relatively unskilled workers can handle the production needs of an entire village, and CARE plans to set up as many village teams as it can. The cost would be about $4,000 a village. That includes $2,000 for a cement mixer and another $1,200 for the timber molds.
Testing.
Finished pillars should withstand the impact of an earthquake. and they're designed so that traditional adobe walls can be filled in between them with no loss of safety. Another casualty of the quake were the ruins of Mixco Viejo, the last Mayan city to be conquered by the Spanish. Excavations began here in the 1950s and were virtually complete when the earthquake occurred, shattering 20 years' painstaking work in just 31 seconds. Many of the plazas, temples, terraces and ramparts were reduced to disorganized pieces, as though someone had knocked over a giant chessboard. Least damaged were the famous ball game patios, of which there are two. The only consolation for the archaeologists was the knowledge that detailed plans were available from which the site could be exactly restored. But the work will take time, perhaps as long as 10 years. It might be thought a misuse of resources to spend money restoring what were already ruins before the earthquake, when there are so many humanitarian needs crying out for attention. But this was an important tourist attraction, and for as long as it remains closed, Guatemala will lose vitally needed foreign currency. In Antigua, the old Spanish capital, a piper calls the faithful to a mass in a temporary open-air church. Normally, he plays in the doorway of the cathedral, but the ancient basilica was badly damaged and has been declared unsafe. Churches, like other buildings, suffered in the quake, and many churchyards are now filled with the freshly dug graves of the victims. The problem of identifying the dead was often difficult and sometimes impossible, and in the first days after the disaster, many victims were buried quickly in mass graves to reduce the risk of epidemics from rotting corpses. The Guatemalans are an intensely religious people, and some have found this unceremonious treatment of the dead difficult to accept. One woman has even burned herself to death as a protest. For some of those who could be identified, death held a final irony. They were entombed in the same kind of adobe-filled walls that had killed them. Easter week in Antigua, the first of many processions, winds its way through the streets, carrying a massive sculpture of Christ on his way to Calvary. From early in the morning till well into the evening, this astonishing burden is carried on the backs of 69 men in a ritual of penance and thanksgiving. The solid, unquestioning faith of these people gives them a fatalism that can't be shaken even by a national tragedy of such proportions. They believe the dead have gone to glory in Christ, while the living have been spared to continue shouldering the burdens of God's work on earth. In Guatemala's present state, it's an attitude that's at least as necessary and productive as any foreign aid.